Okay, today we want to talk about the plate tectonics of Western North America. It's something we'll be focused on in the class. But before we get started on that, I want to talk a little bit about the history of plate tectonics. It's a fundamental framework in which we do most of Earth science, and it's also a fairly young model for how the Earth works, having been developed about 50 to 60 years ago. So, as scientific ideas go, it's relatively young, and it caused major changes in the way Earth science was done. So, in this first presentation, we'll talk about the history. Then, in follow up ones, we'll talk about the details of what a plate boundary is. We'll be studying the details of the plate boundary of Western North America on our field trip. And then specifically, we'll look at subduction zones because that is the primary feature that is affecting Western North America, particularly in the Oregon and Northern California region. And so we will come back and look at this picture of what a subduction zone looks like numerous times as the class develops. Now, many of you, I think, have heard about the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's a feature that is pretty common, referred to every time there's a big earthquake around the world. They oftentimes talk about the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's the area where the major plate, which is the Pacific plate here, which extends over a large part of the planet, is interacting with other plates, North America, where we are residing, and Asia, Eurasia here, etc. And in particular, we're going to focus on this area right in here. That's where our field trip will be, where we have a major change in the nature of the plate boundary. Along here, we have the motion between Pacific and North America, Pacific, North America. But up in here, in the Oregon-Washington area, we have a small plate, this Juan de Fuca plate here, which is subducting or going beneath Western North America. And so we're going to want to understand how that works. But before we get into the details of this, we'll spend the rest of this first presentation talking about the history of plate tectonics and how some of these ideas were developed. And it's something that, although some of the ideas we'll see have been around for a long time, more than 100 years, it's really in the last 50 years or so that the real issues came to bear. So as long ago as the mid-1800s, figures like this were in presentations where people had noticed, because of the shape of Africa and the shape of the Americas, that the two sort of could be made to fit together quite nicely. And so even as long ago as 1858, that's more than 150 years ago, the idea that these continents may be at one time or all together was understood. But the problem that existed until, and is still a point of some research today, is how do they move? Not the fact that Atlantis, the Atlantic continents, and the African Eurasian continents have moved apart, but what actually causes that motion and what happens to the region that was torn apart in this process. Now, the person who is generally given credit for having really proposed this idea is Wegener, and we hear about Wegener's models of the evolution of continents and the concept of what he referred to as continental drift. And so he saw these continental blocks moving around. Now, it's important to recognize that Wegener, in the 1900s, Wegener studied glaciers, and he was a polar scientist, and he had studied what happened when ice flows moved around in the Arctic. And so he saw these big blocks of ice moving around, colliding with each other, moving apart, and that was basically how he saw the behavior of the continents. And so he thought of the continents moving as sort of ice flows or blocks floating in this oceanic regime. And that was part of the problem, is that other scientists, particularly the geophysics community, recognized that the oceans, the continents and the oceans, were both made up of solid rock. And so the concept that the continents could float through the oceans didn't really make sense. And so people fought the concept of continental drift because of that fundamental problem. Although it was compelling to see how all the continents could be made to fit together, what was less compelling was a mechanism to make that happen. And so during this time, this is the period ranging from before World War I. This is 1929. People recognized that there was a difference between ocean and continents. By the period around the time of World War II, and then after World War II, our understanding of how things in the oceans worked became more complete, but there was still no mechanism to do this. The idea that somehow things spread apart, but what actually was happening in the oceans was not well understood. And so these various cartoon pictures were proposed, but none of them really held water, so to speak. At that same time, people began to realize that there were some fundamental differences between continents and oceans. And in particular, the big difference was that the depth that we now know to be the crustal thickness, but from a geophysical perspective, the depth to where you got very high seismic velocities that would be made of rocks such as peridotites or eclogites was quite shallow in the oceans at a depth of 7 to 10 kilometers, whereas in the continents it was at a depth of as much as 35 kilometers to 70 kilometers. And so the idea that there was a fundamental difference between continental lithosphere and oceanic lithosphere was understood back in the 1930s. And so there was not simply enough to say that the continents and the oceans were the same thing, only one was underwater. It was clear that they were made up of different things. And so various people tried to explain how that happened. This is 1960. They really didn't understand. Harry Hess, who is seen as one of the primary workers in plate tectonics, they knew that weird things were going on at these so-called mid-ocean ridges, the areas in the middle of the oceans. The seismic velocities that they measured there were different. They were slower, and people didn't understand why. The idea that there could be molten rock was totally not in the picture, and so they assumed that the low seismic velocities and the upwelled, the high elevations in those areas was simply a function of fractured rocks, the fact that water had gotten in and had converted some of the minerals. But the idea that there might actually be melts at the mid-ocean ridges was not understood as recently as 1960. Now, there were other pieces of data that were coming to bear at the same time, and this had to do with earthquakes. And so this is one of the earlier maps showing the global pattern of earthquakes made in 1954. And what we see is that based on global data, you could see these trends of earthquakes that tended to be into areas that were on the edges through the middle of the oceans, or, for example, here in Indonesia, or in this area of Japan, the Philippines, and the area of India and Asia, or in Europe, we had bands of earthquakes that were oftentimes associated on land with mountain belts, and in the oceans, say in Japan, with volcanoes, and also these others that were paradoxically right in the middle of the oceans, that same area where the seismic characteristics, the velocities were different. And so how to interpret these wasn't clear in 1954. It was obvious that the earthquakes were happening, but equally important was the fact that there were large areas of the planet for which there were few, if any, earthquakes happening. These regions that were away from the belts of earthquakes. And that's going to end up being very important as we talk about developing the concepts of plate tectonics, is what would cause there to be zones of intense earthquake activity bounding or surrounding areas of very little earthquake activity. And if we look at the modern picture of what the earthquake belts look like, we see that even in the picture they had in 1954 is a pretty good representation. And we essentially have three regions of large earthquake activity. We have the belts that go through the middle of the oceans, say through the middle of the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean. We have these belts that extend along the boundary typically between ocean and continents. But those belts tend to be broader. These are very narrow. The ocean ones are narrow. These ones on the continent ocean margins tend to be broader. And then we have a few places, such as in Asia, in Tibet and Asia, and in the whole area between Italy and Iran in the eastern Mediterranean, in which we have diffuse broad zones of earthquakes. As people studied these earthquakes over the last 100 years or so, a couple of things became clear, and the first one was the idea that when one looked at these earthquakes, say along Japan or along South America or Middle America, some very interesting patterns were seen, and in particular, it was the fact that some earthquakes in these areas extended very deep into the earth. And so Hugo Benioff, we talk about the Benioff zones. Well, Hugo Benioff was one of two people. The other was a person by the name of Wadachi. And so we now refer to them as Wadachi-Benioff zones. But what they realized was that, for example, these earthquakes along the margins between the oceans and the continents could extend down as much as 700 kilometers into the earth. Most earthquakes occur in the upper 15 or 20 kilometers, but in these particular areas, there were earthquakes that extended down to 700 kilometers, and very importantly, they went down not vertically, but at an angle. So these so-called Benioff zones or Wadachi-Benioff zones are basically these inclined regions. Now, at the time that they were discovered, neither Benioff or Wadachi had any explanation for them that is anything like what we think today. In fact, the picture that they drew was quite different. They thought that this 700 kilometers was the base of the crust, and that these were basically just no different from regular faults that we see in the upper crust. Thrust faults, normal faults that just happen to extend down to 700 kilometers, and that the earth was very solid down to that depth, and so the earthquakes were occurring on major faults of blocks. This was a view that was fairly well held through the 1950s, but then one thing happened which really caused people to rethink it, and that was the Alaska earthquake in 1964. And the Alaska earthquake was a very large earthquake, magnitude 9 or larger. And one of the key things was that not only did the earthquake rupture a large area near Anchorage, but that there were areas that behaved differently. This part of the system was an area that went up, that uplifted, whereas this part of the system, in here went down. So we had a zone of subsidence and a zone of uplift. And this made no sense if one went back to look at this picture. An earthquake along one of these things would not produce that pattern. And so people realized that whatever was going on in this boundary between the Pacific and North America was more complicated than simply a standard thrust fault. So we had earthquakes were telling us one thing was going on, seismic velocity structure was telling us something, and then a final thing that sort of came into all of this was the magnetic behavior of the oceans. And during World War II, there was a concern about depth charges and submarines and things like that. So ships would, in general, tow a magnetometer, something that would record the magnetic field behind the boat, and they would pick up anomalies if they were passing nearby a submarine, which was a big metal container. And after the war, when people started looking at the data, they saw that there were some interesting patterns. So, for example, if we look at the area, the Juan de Fuca Ridge, which is offshore of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, people saw a pattern that was sort of symmetrical. They saw a region in the middle, and then they saw these areas off to the side that when you flip them, they were basically this corresponded to that. These two peaks here corresponded to those two peaks there, these two peaks, etc. They were like mirror images of each other. And so this made people think about, wow, what is going on? We see these symmetric patterns of seafloor magnetization. Now, at that time, all they could realize was that there were patterns of seafloor magnetization on either side of the mid-ocean ridges. And so what people started to do in a couple of cases is they simply made maps in which if you were above the zero line, these areas, you would fill them in black. And if they were below the zero line, you would leave them white. And when they did that, they produced a map that looked like this for the area. Here is Northern California. The Oregon-California border is about there. The Washington border, well, is up here by the Columbia River. This pattern was seen, and people said, wait a second. We see here's this point of symmetry there. There's another point of symmetry here. There's another point of symmetry here. And we can then look and say, okay, this stuff here and this stuff here are very similar. So this led to the thinking that this could represent a mid-ocean ridge where things are moving apart from it, and for some reason they are recording signals that look similar on either side of it as they move apart. So this was observed along the west coast of North America. There were a lot of data in this area because during World War II, a lot of ships transited this area off the west coast of North America. And similarly, the same sort of map was made further south along most of California. And again, you saw these patterns, but here it was a little more complicated. One couldn't find this nice symmetry anymore, but you did see still the magnetic stripes. So in this area north of Cape Mendocino, we saw symmetry, but south, we just saw a pattern, and that was confusing to many people. At the same time, studies on land were discovering something very interesting, and that is when they went to land and measured the magnetic field that you would record in rocks, in particular volcanic rocks, mostly lava flows and other surface volcanics, you would find that sometimes the rocks had a magnetic field in them that was solid in them that was similar to the present day Earth's magnetic field. That is, a compass would point to the North Pole. But sometimes there were series of lava flows or rocks that had a direction, a magnetic direction that was opposite the present day's field. And so these same samples were then taken to the lab, and at this time they could begin to make determinations of the age of the rocks using various isotopic systems. Initially, it was potassium argon was used on these magnetically rich volcanic rocks. And what they found is that when they plotted the symbol for whether it was normal, that is similar to today, or reversed, they would cluster together based on their ages. And so with that, they put together a model that said, okay, the Earth's magnetic field has been reversing in time. We know the polarity and the age for each of these samples, and so we can then say that they're going to produce a signal. Now, this was done on land, independent of any other data, and it went back to about 4 million years ago. And the problem with going back further in time was that the ability to measure precisely the age of the rocks at that time had about a 10% to 20% uncertainty. So once we get to 4 million years, we're now talking about 4.0 plus or minus 20%. Well, 20% of 4 is about 800,000 years, and we can see that 800,000 years is about the duration of one of these, what were called epochs. And so the problem was that you could have a trouble doing correlations. And so what they were able to do is determine a magnetic polarity timescale, that went back to about 4 million years or so. And so with that, one could re-look at the oceanic data with this perspective. And so people did that and took the data from Western North America, this original feature, and now colored it according to the this anomaly magnetic polarity timescale, and you start to really see this symmetry pattern that's being observed, that the youngest rocks would be along these features here, and they would get progressively older. Now we'll look at this in more detail in the activity that we'll do later in the next week or so. And so this view that there was mid-ocean ridges that were producing hot rock that acquired the Earth's magnetic field and then moved apart while new stuff came up became one of the fundamental tenets of plate tectonics, and it's what we call mid-ocean ridge spreading. And so the idea that the mid-ocean ridges were areas where the plates were moving apart provided a mechanism to explain the patterns that Wegener and others had seen 50 or more years previously. So people can then look in detail at these, and we found that the different mid-ocean ridges were spreading apart at different rates, ranging from things like the mid-Atlantic, which was at about 35 millimeters a year, to something like the East Pacific, which was about 5 times faster at 160 millimeters per year. They all were in the middle of the oceans. These were still along the belts that we saw those earthquakes, but they were moving apart based on using this sort of a time scale and the magnetic anomalies. We found that they were moving at quite different rates. At the same time, people also found that they had quite different morphologies. The East Pacific rise, which was moving apart fairly fast, had this very nice sort of domal feature to it. There was a rise in the middle, and that sort of goes even into the name, a rise. The Southeast Indian Ridge or the Mid-Atlantic Ridge were characterized by there being a general uplift, but superimposed on that right in the middle was a rift, a down drop block in the middle. And so there were even morphologic things that were different between those that were spreading fast versus those that are spreading more slowly. And so that became another characteristic that people began to understand. These magnetic anomalies could then be put onto maps, and we have maps like this which show, for example, here's the mid-ocean ridge off of the west coast of North America, and this region in here is material that was produced at this ridge and has spread across that way, and it has comparable material over here which has moved apart in a similar way. And so we will exploit these data sets to figure out what's going on along the margin here in some activities we'll do in the future. So we have gone from a totally no understanding of how the Earth worked to this sort of a picture. But there was a third component that came into it, and that was people had understood the idea of where we had collisions in those big earthquake belts and that things were moving apart. But there were other features, like what about something like this feature here? What is this that's separating one ridge from another? How do those work? And no one had a good interpretation. And so in about 1965, J. Tuzo Wilson, who was a Canadian earth scientist, proposed a new type of fault that totally took the geologic world by storm. People actually thought he was crazy. This was not acceptable. And these were what he called transform faults. And they connected up other types of plate boundaries. So he made up, in this paper, he talked about all the different types you could do. You could have a transform fault that was connecting a mid-ocean ridge to a convergent or a subduction zone. You could have one that was connecting two separate ridge segments. And he went through all of the characteristics of those that. And then he said these are very common, and in fact may be the primary type of faults that we see that are neither ridges nor trenches. And he went through explanations about how they might happen, how they might form, and this became an explanation both for explaining the features that were observed along the mid-Atlantic, where you had these features, and the idea was that when Africa and South America rifted apart, they didn't break along a smooth line, rather they broke along some offset like that, and this then became a feature like that. We now know that these types of ridges don't exist, and rather this feature here would break up into a series of ridge segments and transforms like that, and this then becomes the Atlantic. But these transform faults not only existed in the mid-ocean ridge things, perhaps the most famous of them would be along the west coast of North America, and this will be part of our course, and that is we have the ridge that's in the Pacific Northwest offshore that we saw before. There's a connection to that down off of the coast of Baja California, and connecting those two up is essentially a major transform fault, which is the San Andreas. And so the San Andreas was now suddenly understood to be a different type of a fault, not just simply a fault in the continent, but rather a plate boundary, a structure that was connecting two other types of plate boundary structures. So with that, we'll stop here. This is a very quick view of how we got from no understanding of the Earth's behavior to the current thing where we have multiple types of plate boundaries of different sorts. And then over the next semester and on our field trip, we'll see how this plays out into geological features.